Hi, I'm Morag Grant and I work for the City of Edinburgh Council with a lifelong learning, with an adult learning lead in the southeast locality of Edinburgh. So
how did you use the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities resources?
I decided to use the literacy groups that I already look after, 5 literacy groups in the area, and decided to have conversations with staff and with learners and with other stakeholders. I did use the data guide to help prepare myself a lot, to give myself some background information, and I did actually find that probably the most helpful tool, to a bit of a wake-up call to remind myself about the some of the issues around, some of the up-to-date data, so that I could then also look at the framework itself, the draft framework, and decided which section to use and which challenge questions to use from that. Yes, we decided to look at the issue around unconscious assumptions that might be around in a learning environment between the tutor and the learner. The tutor is looking at devising with the learner an individual learning plan. So that's quite unique compared to a large group. The tutor could really have a one-to-one chat with the learner, and I wanted to explore to see how much gender bias might be there, either from the learner's part or from the tutor's part, when they're having that discussion around goal setting. I also looked at the how long learners stay in the group and the different gender balance of our users in our service and who we are actually reaching. The questions were not easy to use directly with learners or with tutors, actually. I could explain to the group, I went along to groups and actually spoke out the questions, and then we had conversations around it, and then we took the recordings of that. I also then had supplementary questions that helped break down what I was trying to ask in the questionnaires. Yeah, so I think as standalone questions, they were good conversation starters for myself and for staff and learners, but they did need to be broken down a little bit further to make it meaningfully for my piece of work as well. I did find the extra reading that was linked to in the guide would probably make quite good kind of, training potential or training resources in the future.
What was the impact of using the resources? What did you learn about gender balance and equalities in your CLD service?
I found on carrying out the small pilot that doing some research beforehand and looking at 5 years of participation, because I looked at the participation bit in the data tool guide. So I decided to look at 5 years of what special characteristics evidence we did hold and see what we had regarding male, female. We had information about SIMD areas as well. So I was able to kind of go with, prepared with that kind of information. But also learnt a trend around having much more amounts of female approaching the service and looking for support in the service, but actually quite a healthy amount of males joining the service and actually staying longer in the service than the females. So there was things that you sometimes assume and then sometimes things that come out as a surprise as well. And the learners were quite interested to hear that as well. They also mentioned very much the other barriers that affect them and they believed would make difficult for other people to access the service too. So they mentioned equally not just we perhaps might not be reaching as many men and carrying out publicity and marketing ourselves where more men may be, but also said that there was equally other barriers for women and men around income, travel, mobility, heating, buildings, access, all the other barriers that some of which we're aware of, and they mentioned some other ones as well.
What will you do now? What changes will you make to your service?
What we want to look at now is what is incorporated in the training for tutors, and not just the literacy tutors. I was actually carrying out this small pilot with literacy tutors who, as you probably know, across Scotland, there's quite a lot of literacy training provision that tutors go through before they get to the point of being paid tutors in a group. And they also then have experience of a lot of individual work. So they were very highly aware of topics around unconscious bias and had actually come across it and discussed it in their training and in their training as volunteers before that too. So I think looking at those topics around general training for other tertiary workers would be very important. Although it didn't seem to be as evidently needed by the tutors we were in touch with this pilot, I think it possibly needs to be explored for tertiary staff wider. A refresh for us all regularly, a refresh and an update of the data on a regular basis would be useful. Ourselves, we have to look locally at how we keep our data. We're in a transition phase, having had a data management system that we used, and we're in a transition to identifying a more useful one. I would like to kind of gauge staff appetite for how much training and how much that could be incorporated into general self-evaluation training rather than the gender imbalance sitting separately, so that staff are not overwhelmed by lots of different areas of information coming in, and look at having a refresh of training alongside, you know, how good is our learning. It could be something that's a two-part training as well. Well, we would certainly be looking at our marketing strategy as literacy staff across the city as to how we actually reach people. The learners came up, when we were interviewing them, the learners came up with quite a lot of interesting ideas. You know, get back to Big Plus, get back to big adverts on buses, but also on a more local way about telling us about where people hang out, where we might be able to attend to actually tell people about our service to make sure it's reaching a wider audience.
Do you have any advice for other CLD providers thinking of using their resources?
I would encourage them to definitely look at the data tool guide, and I myself found it quite inspiring and certainly useful to then go off and decide what angle I wanted to take and what would be meaningful for my service. But also it gave me then the background information I needed, alongside looking at my own local policies and the local data I had. So I would certainly encourage people to look at that. I myself found the actual the strategy document itself quite large, and I've said that before. So I think it was important to then decide to just start small, which is what I did. I decided to do it in a manageable chunk with groups that I already had contact with staff that I knew I could approach. There may be issues around individual training for people as well. I found it quite a challenge to remind myself how to write a simple questionnaire to make sure it was transparent and clear and legible, and the information I could collate from it would be, you know, make sense. So actually there may be some training elements. So give yourself the time to decide, how do I want to approach this? And do I need to get any support or training beforehand to make sure I'm doing it properly? And ask other people. I was showing other people the questionnaires I had written and asking them if it made sense. And then they would some said, no, could you explain that a bit better? It's quite a difficult concept to put over. And I think that goes back to some of the challenge questions. If you ask them exactly as they were, people inevitably then go, what do you mean by that? Explain more. So it was about breaking it down and making it. And sometimes we didn't do questionnaires. Sometimes we just did conversations and recorded them as well. So depending upon the stakeholder and their preferred way of communicating, we did it in different ways to try and collect the information.